Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and I am thrilled to death today. I get to talk to Michele Landsberg. You know, I've heard that lady's name I've lived in Canada over 50 years now, and she was already a force to be reckoned with when I arrived. Didn't take me very long to get acquainted with the name of Michele Landsberg. And of course her notable family, which we don't need to go into the politics of, but I imagine, yes, indeed, I will, right now, off the bat. I hear that your son Avi is running, right, to be...
He is going to run for the leadership of the NDP, yes. Yeah. He ran as a candidate twice in difficult ridings in Vancouver. Didn't make it, partly because of the Trump thing that happened. But he's quite determined to make an effort to win the leadership. Yeah.
Well, he would be certainly in a great tradition, a family tradition.
Thank you,
and you've already met Jill Carr-Harris.
Yes.
Who is often on these shows now because she's sort of like a co-host, or at least she's learning to pretend to be Meta Spencer. And that's quite a challenge because I'm now 94, and we have to plan for somebody to take over, and she is the most likely. So Jill is just a wonderful asset has made my life much more comfortable lately, now that I know she's around and ready to do things. So anyway, and she met you by going to one of your Women in Black demonstrations downtown. And that's really what we want to talk about today, because I hear that late in your life, you have become, what did you call it, a post-Zionist?
Post-Zionist. Yes, it's true. I didn't have a Zionist family or particularly religious. My parents were lovely people, but uneducated. They didn't have any particular strong religious practice. We did, light the Sabbath candles and the Hanukkah candles and have a Seder every Passover. But I feel like I was a born atheist. Yes. I never really had any belief in a divine presence. And I'm not sure that my parents really did either, except in a very conventional passing way. So that was not a force in our life. What was a big force in my early childhood, and I was born in 1939, so my whole first 10 years were sort of suffused with an aura of panic and dread in the small Jewish community in Toronto. And like to be clear that we did not live within the Jewish community. We were in a non-Jewish neighborhood, sort of lower middle class, and anti-Semitism was a daily force, daily. Wow. It was very, very bad at public school. We had a principal called Mr. Karouche, who was very openly anti-Semitic. And every year when the Jehovah's Witnesses were invited into our public school to lead an assembly where we would have to swear, raise your right hand now and swear to pray to Jesus every day. Well, Meta and Jill, I think you can empathize with, here it's wartime. Jews are being persecuted, which I knew only a little bit about. My parents hid everything, as did most parents. But there was this atmosphere of being in hiding almost. Like when we lit our Hanukkah candles, which traditionally you put in the window proudly, my mother hid them in the kitchen. Never said anything, but of course I learned from that it was a little bit dangerous to show people on the street that you were Jewish. Well, to have that much anti-Semitism anchored in the school, every day there was something. In grade 2, an occasional teacher came in and said, "Are there any Jews in this class?" There were 2 of us. We put up our hands nervously, and she said, "Class, we will now pray to God that these heathens won't go to hell. I remember that very vividly. But this is the sort of thing that happened every day. Like Karush threatened us with the strap if we wouldn't swear to pray to Jesus. And every day we had to say a Christian prayer, Our Father, which art in heaven, every single day. And we had to sing Christmas hymns and Easter songs. And it was a public school. It was suffused both with Christianity and with anti-Semitism. So, of course, I grew up feeling an outsider and guarded about the world I was living in.
Yeah.
So that's the background. Even when I have so many of these memories so you'll understand. When my mother signed me up to go to school, Allenby Public School, and we went into the office to be signed up for kindergarten. And the secretary was filling in the form. And then she said, religion. And my mother was scared. My mother was a very sweet and polite person. She really valued manners and politeness. And I felt her grip my hand very tightly at that question. So I knew that, you can be 4 or 5 years old, but you know what your mom's feeling. And she gripped my hand, and there was a long pause. And then she said the silliest phrase I'd ever heard, we're of the Mosaic persuasion. Which, it didn't mean a thing, but she couldn't say to this secretary, we're Jewish, because she was frightened. So,
did the secretary know what that meant?
Well, she noted something down. I don't know what. That part, I was too young to really calculate. But I know that before kindergarten began, my father was a rough, tough kind of guy, not like my mother at all, quite the opposite. So he said, they're going to teach you a song in kindergarten. Jesus loves me, yes, I know, for the Bible tells me so. And he said, now, when they sing that song, you sing this. So typical of my father's irreverent humor. Jesus loves me, yes, I know. Very kind of Jesus. So I did sing that, and they never caught me.
They didn't catch you?
No. So, I was ripe for some kind of salvation, because this was not a comfortable way to grow up. And when I was 13 in grade 9, we had moved to the suburbs, which were even crazier. There were no Jews for miles around. I was at a very big high school, and there was one other Jew that I knew of, a girl 1 grade ahead of me. And she came to me one day and said, you ought to come to this Jewish club I belong to downtown. And I was sort of intrigued, and I agreed to go with her. She had to nag me for a couple of months before I went with her. And here were a bunch of kids meeting with leaders who were in their late teens, who were very charismatic to us 13-year-olds. And these kids were passionately discussing philosophers and ideas and books. Like, this is what I'd been thirsting for up in my barren suburb where there wasn't even a single bookstore in all of Willowdale at that time. Horrible.
You were in Willowdale.
Yes, yeah, Young and Shepherd.
And again, at what age were you then?
13.
Oh, yeah.
So I went downtown with this friend, and I was extremely excited to discover a group of kids I didn't know existed, kids like me, I was a big, passionate reader. So, and to live the life of ideas, that was so exciting. And the dominant idea, of course, was Zionism, that we would inherit this land where we'd be safe. It was just after World War II. People still weren't talking very openly about the Holocaust. There was a decade of terrified silence there where people didn't talk about it. It was so incomprehensible a crime, so huge. And I
Okay,
gradually
now
learned.
let's pause there.
Yes,
Really what I was wondering, what was the trajectory from the experiences where they were so horrible to you overtly
yeah,
to the time when they would start treating you as I presume the normal thing is to act as if they don't know whether you're Jewish or not, and it didn't make any difference. So that from one point to the other, how long did that take? And was there a certain moment when public opinion flipped, or was it a gradual thing? How
it
did you
was
get from
gradual.
this
Yes.
overt anti-Semitism to, I don't know what you would call
Polite neo-colonial anti-Semitism.
okay, all right.
And this really tricked me for a long time. I mean, uh, I believed people. You'd think that's a bit strange for a reporter, made her living digging under the surface of things, but I didn't understand when people were being anti Semitic to me after the 50s. I would say Canadian society, having learned more about the Holocaust, became ashamed of overt anti Semitism. During the Holocaust, after all, even the highest public elected officials were openly anti Semitic.
Mhm.
None is too many, they said, when the Jews begged to allow some refugees to come to Canada. How many are allowed, sir? None is too many, was the reply. And that famously became the title of a book that documented Canada's official anti Semitism. So people became that the publication of that book made a huge difference in public attitudes. But even before that, they were beginning to be a bit ashamed. And I had many incidents where I failed to pick up the anti Semitism. When I applied to graduate school, I was longing to go to continue my studies in English literature. Our dean was a fusty old conservative bastard. He hated women. He despised anything progressive. He was a horrible man.
Who was this? Your dean, you say?
The dean of English.
Uh-huh.
And when I went to him, you had to have your dean's recommendation or you couldn't go to graduate school.
Uh-huh.
And I've repeated this story too often, perhaps, but it was such a dramatic moment in my life. He was the only one at University College at the University of Toronto, which was more of an independent college. There were a lot of Jewish kids there. We didn't follow all the old traditions of Victoria College. He was the only prof who wore a gown.
Okay.
He was very big with his gown. And when I said, I've come to ask for your support in applying to graduate school in English, well, Miss Landsberg, and I'll tell you, the only reason you would go to graduate school is to teach English at the University of Toronto, which of course was the finest English literature department. And he said, but no woman will ever be allowed to teach English here. No woman has been allowed so long as I've been dean, and no woman ever shall be allowed so long as I'm here. That was right. No woman ever did get to teach English while Woodhouse was there. But I walked out of his office. This was what was wrong about this moment. I was burning with humiliation because there was no feminist movement. I thought, how could I have thought I was good enough to go to graduate school? That's what I internalized. And later, a few years later, as I began to realize how ridiculous that was, I began to be so angry and upset with myself for accepting his view. But then years later, my best friend, who was an English scholar and did get to teach at University of Toronto and knew Woodhouse very well, and I said, oh, what a misogynist. I never got there because of being a woman. She said, oh, don't be so stupid. You were also a Jew, and he would never let a Jew into his department.
Let me tell you, because you may have actually known my dear friend Rita Rosen, who was also a student at University College, probably about the same time you were. She's dead now, so I can't check with her about whether she knew you at that time, but
I
I don't remember
don't.
what her first name would have been, her surname, but at that point, but her name was Rita, Rheta, and she told me another story that is as bad as yours. She
Wow.
told me that when she went to the dormitory, the house mother or somebody told her how to wash herself as if she didn't know, and so on, and asked her, said, "Can I feel your horns?"
No, not that one. Oh, God.
She said that happened to her.
Oh,
I said,
yes,
I didn't even know what that meant, and she said, "Well, Jews, if you feel under their hair, they're supposed to have little horns."
because
Is
we're
that
the
true?
spawn of the devil.
Well, but she told me this is a true fact.
Oh, I know. No, no, it's happened to many people I know. That was a common belief. Listen, when I was growing up in Toronto in the 40s and 50s, there was such ignorance about anything except the mainstream Protestant, whatever. In grade 9, when our blessed Toronto board insisted that we study The Merchant of Venice,
Mhm.
and grade nines back in 1951, 52, they were not sophisticated. There was no internet, there was barely any television yet. And I remember as we started studying this play, one boy put up his hand, Miss, I thought all the Jews died out in Bible time.
Yeah.
So the Miss Mumby, the teacher, asked me to stand up and explain that Jews still existed. And when the class asked, well, what is usury? Oh, Michelle will explain. She's Jewish.
Oh my
It's,
God. All right.
it's unbelievable, really, the world we grew up in. It's hard to picture it now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
gradually, people became ashamed of those attitudes. It was a long, slow process. And Hesh Troper and Irving Abella's book, None is Too Many, that was the bombshell that changed so many Canadians when they saw what they had been part of and how their government had been very quiet about the first major genocide known to the world. So, I mean, the Armenian genocide did precede it by 100 years, but people weren't too aware of that. So, that was why I embraced Zionism with such fervor as a young teenager. It was an identity, I could belong. It gave me an ideal. I mean, I already had these ideals, I don't know where they came from, of egalitarianism. And I was beginning to be a feminist just on my own hook, my own perception of things. And I managed after a year of struggle because I still had a children's card, not an adult card. I had to fight with the librarians. I got Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex from the library, and I was transformed. I was 13 and I was so thrilled. There were large parts of it I didn't understand, but I could see she was talking about the same things I had felt and seen. And it just affirmed everything in the world for me. And at the same time, I was part of this group that was saying we're going to build a new country that's socialist, completely egalitarian between men and women. And these were the stated ideals of Israel at the beginning and for many years. In fact, when I traveled to Israel in 1957 to study there for a year and work on a kibbutz, at that time, the right-wing parties, including the right-wing youth movement, was so small and insignificant that we laughed at them. We thought, what ridiculous beliefs! They'll vanish in a year or two.
Now, were
Little
they
did we know.
the right wingers? Were they Orthodox or
No,
traditional? No.
no. On the boat going over, I met a boy who told me he was a member of Beitar, and Beitar was the right wing youth arm of Likud, and which to us was a very minor party and certainly not religious. They were right wing. If you've heard of Jabotinsky, who was a leader of right-wing armed rebellion against the British in colonial Palestine. Jabotinsky argued that the Jews should murder and fight and do everything that the British were doing to us. And he led a very small group, but it made a lot of noise and did murder people. So Beitar, the youth group, followed this lunatic, Jabotinsky. And I burst out laughing when he told me he was a member of Beitar. The right wing was so insignificant. And we were on our way at that very moment to a country ruled by the Labour Party, and I was so sure this was my ideal. It wasn't long after I arrived.
Now, yes. You've made this leap from being kind of a secular atheist, not
right,
a Willowdale girl,
yes,
to being a fervent young Zionist.
Yes.
What did your parents think when you made this transition?
Well, they were very baffled by it. Zionism was not a popular concept in the Jewish community in Toronto. In fact, I had been sent as a small child to Holy Blossom religious school. They called it Sunday school. It was a very assimilationist kind of reform congregation. You were supposed to look and sound like everybody else, but still be Jewish. A fine line. And my mother was so upset and confused by this new thing I was involved in. She spoke to the head of the religious school, and he spoke to the rabbi, and they both took me aside and said, "You mustn't get involved in this."
Yeah, okay.
Yes, this is, and the head of the religious school, he was a very interesting bright man who arrived from Germany just in time, I think, or maybe as a refugee, I'm not sure which. But he undertook to drive me home to Willowdale after Sunday school so he would have lots of time to lecture me about it. And I'll never forget what he said because I didn't understand him then. Only much later I understood. He said, "This Zionist youth movement, it's all games and seduction, games and seduction." And he meant ideological seduction. He had seen the rise of Nazi Germany. He knew about intellectual seduction, right? I didn't know what he meant because to me, seduction was sexual. So I was totally confused. But years later, I saw, yeah, every youth movement is like that, whatever sect, Christian, whatever, Girl Guides, Boys Guides, their indoctrination of one kind or another. And this was Zionist indoctrination, and we were very passionately, intellectually grounded. I mean, there are many forms of Zionism. There's labor Zionism, there's spiritual, there's all sorts of forms of Zionism, and we would debate them all. We educated ourselves. It was very thrilling. It was intellectually thrilling to have, I mean, the school certainly never offered any intellectual meat to a kid like me, but the Zionist youth movement did. So
Michele, when you went to Israel in 1957, did you work on a kibbutz?
Yes.
At that particular time? So
the
whole mythology of cooperative farming and socialist values.
Yes.
And again, that was also a big draw, wasn't it?
Huge. Yes. I went to a program designed for youth leaders from abroad. We spent 6 months at a school in Jerusalem, intensively learning Hebrew and Israeli history and so on. And then we spent 6 months, 3 months per each kibbutz, one down on the Gaza border, where I had the interesting experience of being shot at by an Egyptian farmer just across the line. And the other one was in northern Israel. So yes, I worked in a lot. I worked in the potato harvest, in the apple orchards, in the cotton, in the vineyards. One of my first experiences going to work on the kibbutz, I was assigned to planting grapevine cuttings. And the two people working with me were two adorable little Arab girls from a nearby village. wearing brilliant colors. And I was so charmed by them, and I wanted to chat with them, but they spoke Hebrew. They spoke Arabic. I only spoke Hebrew and English, so we couldn't really communicate. And the guy in charge of the vineyard said to me after the first couple of days, "Don't bother with trying to talk with those kids. They're from the village. They're not part of us." So I was beginning to see I can't claim that I was smart enough to get the level of discrimination and racism. I didn't see it, and I didn't see the harm that had been done to Palestinians, except for one thing. When we were hiking in the countryside, sometimes we'd come across the rubble of a little Arab village, and I was very disturbed by that, and I never put it together that they'd been driven out, that these houses had been burned down or destroyed. I didn't put it together. It took me decades to open my eyes, decades and decades. And unfortunately, you know, there are a fair number on the left in Canada as elsewhere who are pretty anti-Semitic. You know? And they were the first to jump on the anti-Israel thing. And I sensed their ulterior motives and angrily fought back, defending Israel through many, many, many dreadful things that I wasn't fully aware of. But that's when you fall for an ideal, sometimes it's very hard to let go. And I can really understand the stubborn, obdurate Jewish community in Toronto right now that will not open their eyes to a genocide going on in front of us. The horror of that genocide, they won't admit it to their consciousness. And I can't be too judgmental because for many years I was just as willfully unknowing. And when I moved to New York in the mid-'80s, and I met a group of friends who are still my friends, New Yorkers are way more open than Torontonians. It's easy to make friends in New York, not easy in Toronto. Mm-hmm. So I still have cherished friends from New York. I see them every year at our feminist Seder. When I can get to New York, I see them more often. And they were very preoccupied, as I was, with the wrong of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. We were protesting that. And the fact that they could protest it openly and not be slammed by the Jewish community was very heartening to me. So gradually I was able to let go of some of my defensiveness and begin to see more of what was really happening. But it took me many years. I have to credit my son and daughter-in-law who argued with me for years about Israel. And my daughter-in-law, Naomi Klein, who's brilliant and lovely, I owe her a lot. I remember arguing all one night with her when they were first married. And my final argument was, we have to have Israel as a safe haven. This was right after terrorists had blown up a Jewish community center in Rio de Janeiro. And they were Palestinian terrorists. Mm. And Naomi looked at me and said, "Do you really think Israel makes us safe? Israel is endangering us."
Wow.
And
about her, your whole family. How many people went along with your point of view at the same rate, or were there disagreements within your extended family about your changing or your convictions, which I presume by the time you were in New York, you were already very skeptical about Zionism.
Yes.
Yeah, and you were even participating in groups that opposed it,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So, but by then, had everybody in your family swung along with you, or or were there problems? You say you had an argument with Naomi, but she must have already been there before you were.
Yeah, she was never a Zionist. She was anti-Zionist from her teenage years. And, she's piercingly intelligent. She sees through almost everything. So she was way ahead of me there. And her arguments were very cogent. They didn't take me all the way because it's emotional. I was emotionally attached to this ideal that I couldn't quite let go. But Avi was never as persuaded as I was, never much of a Zionist, and he went along with Naomi's views very quickly. My two daughters, also my older daughter, was very aware and skeptical long before I was. So there was no real disagreement in the family, except that I was a Zionist longer than the kids were. And Stephen grew up, of course, in a Bundist family. You probably don't know what the Bund is, but
I've heard of it, but I don't really understand what it was all about.
At the turn of the 20th century, in the late 1800s, very late, and early 1900s, the workers in Eastern Europe, the Jewish workers, formed a socialist, secular, non-Zionist organization, a labor organization that had 125,000 signed up members in 1910 or 12. And it was called the Bund, the Socialist Bund. And that was the biggest paid up membership of any organization in Eastern Europe at that time. It was a force, the Bund. My late father-in-law, David Lewis, grew up in Eastern Europe as a Bundist, child of a Bundist. And when he came to Canada at the age of 12 and began to, he learned English very quickly. He became active in the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, as it was then called. And he wanted to bring the Bundist values, which involved the workers, not just the good ministers like Tommy Douglas and the prairie populace and so on, but also the industrial workers. So that was David's mission, and he did change it. He changed the party. It became the New Democratic Party, and those socialist values were passed down to all his 4 children. And so Stephen was never so swayed by Zionism as I was. Never. It wasn't in his background. Like, he had his own socialist ideals, and they were here. And in fact, part of the Bund, the core belief of the Bund, I don't know how I got onto this, but I just love it so much, is expressed in a Yiddish word, doheit, which means here-ness. Wherever we are, that will be our ideal place, and we will work to build it in fairness and equality. This was the Bund. World War II ended the Bund. It killed off everybody, but you've heard of the Warsaw Uprising, and it should be noted that that was led and largely populated by Bundists. They were the ones who fought back against the Nazis. But when people talk about the uprising, they never mention what was the political affiliation, but I'm proud to say it was Bundist. Anyhow, that's quite a sideline. But these socialist ideals were what fired my love of Zionism. And Stephen, growing up in a very secular socialist family, was fired up by socialist ideals, but to be enacted here in Canada. So that was the background, and it took me so long to let go of it. It just, like, trauma doesn't beget saintliness. What trauma begets is more trauma usually, and the trauma of the Holocaust, and trying to deal with it by myself as a child because none of the adults I knew talked about it. So I was dealing with this horror that had just happened, like last year, and there was nobody to talk.
Yeah, can you explain to me why they wouldn't talk about it? I've everybody says that. I know it's true, but I don't. Really.
Well, I think Elie Wiesel wrote his book 10 years after. His book, Silent When Night, I think was called. And he talks about the Great Silence. He could not talk about the horror. The trauma was so deep. And there was no way to explain to people who hadn't been through it, who had just blithely gone along with their lives while all this was happening to us. It was so hard to explain. He writes about that.
So who wrote it?
Eli
Wiesel.
Wiesel, a very famous, now dead Jewish author. He was revered for that book because he went through Auschwitz as a young teenager, he and his father, and his soul-bearing book about what he endured became a classic almost instantly. But it was 10 years after the war before he could write it. And he talks about that, how there just wasn't even language to say they deliberately made us into subhumans. I mean, nobody could understand it even. So it took years before the Jewish community that I knew did not speak about the Holocaust.
Well, I guess the only parallel I can think of is my father-in-law was in the First World War, in the trenches and so on, and he never talked about it. And of course, even, in the rest of his life, we never knew what went on. But I guess it's similar, right?
It is. It's similar. The trauma is so deep, and you don't have the feeling that others will understand it. I, growing up with all this anti-Semitism around me, why would I talk about the Holocaust with people who didn't care about it and who libeled me from the time I was a little kid? You didn't want to share it. It was too horrible. And it's very complicated. And I'm sure a lot of scholars have written about why that great silence descended on the Jewish community. But we were alienated from most of the world. Churchill knew, Roosevelt knew, everybody knew, but
okay. Now, what made this switch? What happened to change that?
To change what? About ending the silence?
Yes, the ending the silence. What made it? As I understand it, even in Israel, people didn't talk about it.
Well, in Israel, it was a different story. In Israel, as we have it on good authority, like Amos Oz, the great author, who he wrote his memoir. You're doubtful about that, Jill?
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I do think that his memoir was very revealing. And he talks about how Holocaust survivors arriving in Israel were denigrated by the Israelis, who did not want to know that Jews could be so weak and powerless and persecuted. They saw themselves as vigorous. I can't quite explain this ideal of the kibbutz member who was strong and nothing could terrify him and blah, blah. They didn't want to know about these weak survivors who came broken and battered to their country. So they weren't all very kind. And I think this was true everywhere. We lived in a little rented duplex, and the man who lived upstairs with his wife and children, there was something wrong with him. And he kept disappearing. And the police would come to our door and ask if we'd seen or heard of him. He was missing. And they found his body in a ditch somewhere. And I think he'd killed himself. But all this was hush hush. And I think he was a survivor who just couldn't cope. So, the silence, I'm not the best one. I'm not a scholar of this era particularly, but my view is that the trauma was too great. Just as survivors of childhood incest don't talk about it. Don't talk about this horror because there aren't words to express how deep it goes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why. But once Wiesel's book came out, that sort of opened the floodgates. And many more people started to write memoirs about what they'd been through. Enough time had passed that they could cope with it. And then, of course, the world was flooded with thousands of books about it and thousands of testimonials. And thank God people did feel they could speak out and tell the world what had happened. So, yeah, but there was that silence, and that's the period I was growing up in.
I just wanted to note, Michele, that Avi and Naomi came out of a different generation.
Yes.
Perhaps closer to my generation. And in the 70s, when I was in, latter part of high school and entering university, we really, really were integrated with our Jewish friends. I mean, it was, and we saw, of course, Orthodox Jews as different, but then moderate and progressive Jews as being very aligned around liberal values.
Right.
So I grew up totally integrated with my Jewish friends, which I have till today. I mean, there was nothing. So it's just the course of that 10-generation flip.
Yes. Yep.
It was amazing.
Yeah. Amazing. And I think Avi and my older daughter, Elena, and my younger daughter, Jenny, they would all agree that this was not their experience growing up. They were as astonished as my Gentile friends to hear about some of this. The difference is that I many times experienced Gentile friends just saying, oh no, that didn't happen. I was invited once to Massey College in the late 80s, and I had frowned upon Massey College as a male-only misogynist institution, and I had lots of reasons I could tell you about it, but I was invited to come to the high table, as they called it. They built in the patriarchy, boy. So I thought, okay, I'll go and see what they're making of this place. And sitting across from me at the high table was a very distinguished historian. And the people around me started talking about their primary school. And he said, well, I went to Allenby. And I said, so did I. And he said, wasn't it wonderful? I said, no, I experienced so much anti-Semitism there, I can't say it was wonderful. And he actually sat there and had the boldness to say to me, oh no, there was no anti-Semitism. Like, this was a so-called historian, winner of many awards, who just sat there denying my own reality to my face. So a good thing to remember when you're reading history. But yes, that all passed. And thank heavens, my kids did not, when we lived in Scarborough, my kids did suffer a lot of anti-Semitism in the public school. They were the only Jews, and there was an older German boy in their class who hung a swastika over their desk and carved one into the front door of the school and persecuted and beat up my kids until I had to take them out of school and homeschool them till we could move out of that neighborhood. We sold the house and moved.
Now, what years would that have been?
That would have been in the late 70s.
No, really?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, when I first came to Canada, I lived in an apartment building in Willowdale.
But this was Scarborough. We had moved to Scarborough because Stephen represented that area. So, yeah.
I didn't know of any anti-Semitism of that kind. So it's a big surprise to me in the 70s, because my son would have been in school in Willowdale. No, he went to the French school, so he didn't experience.
That's a little different. That's different. This was totally shocking to me. And I really had thought by that time in my life, anti-Semitism is a thing of the past in Canada. I really thought that. I mean, I was very active in the party and in school reform efforts and in all sorts of efforts working with the larger community. And I never thought about anti-Semitism anymore. And then my kids went through this. It was unbelievable. So I went to the teacher and said, it's inappropriate for a swastika to be hanging over their desk. And she said, oh, well, it's an ancient Hindu symbol or something. And she wouldn't take it down. So I went to the principal And he said, well, we've talked to this boy's parents, but it's useless. They're just proud of the grandfather who fought with the Luftwaffe, and they're proud of their German, he didn't say Nazi, heritage. So, nobody would defend my kids. And finally, I had to take them out of that school. They were getting beaten up. And when I would hear them in the morning, I mean, these are kids 8 and 9 years old. They're getting dressed, ready for school, and they're whispering, if Jason gets you in the corner and starts kicking you, you yell for me and I'll go get so-and-so. They were being actively hit and hurt every day by this young gangster who was in their class and his followers. So, yeah, it still existed in pockets. I agree with you, Meta. It wasn't everywhere. It was in, Scarborough at that time. And I'm very happy how much it's changed. It would be hard to find a white face there now, but it was only white then.
I was teaching, of course, in universities all that period. And honestly, I did not see anti-Semitism in universities. I have to say, that's not where it was. Maybe in the grade schools, maybe, I don't know, I believe every word you're saying, but it does not conform to anything I experienced in all the time I was teaching at universities.
Meta, are you Jewish?
No.
You wouldn't see it, and you wouldn't know it. It wouldn't happen to you, and you'd be one of those who would say, oh, no, there's no anti-Semitism in the very year that I was being told I couldn't go to graduate school. Yes, it existed. It didn't impinge on you or the people you knew. How would you know it was happening? It wasn't something that was written up in the papers. It wasn't anything being recorded.
I could see prejudice against blacks. And
yep.
I remember one period of time when there was an extraordinary upsurge of hostility toward what they call Pakis, Pakistani immigrants to Canada.
That's right, yes.
And then later the Chinese. When I was teaching, and a lot of students came from China, foreign students were in my classes. And I was on the governing council of the University of Toronto, and we had meetings in which people, the faculty members were standing up and talking about how to reduce the number of overseas Chinese students in our classes, as if that's, a good thing to do, because that was anti-Chinese. So yeah. I saw other forms of ethnic antagonism or discrimination, but not.
You didn't see the anti-Semitism, and I would say it was certainly not as prevalent as anti-Black racism. Certainly not, but it was there, and it's never gone away. Not everyone. It's not like it used to be, but I think because of Netanyahu's genocide, there will be anti-Semitism, ferocious anti-Semitism for a century. I think he's put us all in harm. He's damaged all of us because people find it very hard to separate Jewish from Zionist. They can't quite grasp it. It's not anything they've ever had to.
Well, I would disagree.
You think that people can distinguish?
I think that for sure, there was plenty of anti-Israel belief, and which I shared.
Right.
Among university students, this was clear, but I think in everybody's mind, it was not about anti-Semitism. I really don't believe that. I really, really, really have the view that the confusion between anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli politics is being used and whipped up and exploited unjustly and untruthfully. That isn't really what was going on or what is going on in most of the universities now. But
of course, I haven't been
teaching for a long time, so things could have changed. But
no, I agree with you. I think that this specter of anti-Semitism, and it's so confusing because anti-Semitism is real
Mm.
and harmful.
Mm.
But this specter of anti-Semitism has been weaponized by the conventional Jewish community and the right wing and the powerful. There are some very wealthy people who fund these propaganda efforts, and they have whipped it up. So, in a way, they're creating the very thing that they're exploiting in their own defense. But it's also the genocide. I can tell you, Meta, for sure, educated people are not going to mix up Netanyahu's crimes with ordinary Jewish people. But that's not everyone. There's a huge mass of people who don't read the papers and who think,
Yeah, that's where
oh,
we agree.
Israel, that's Jewish. You know, we're out there with our vigil, and a woman goes by. We've got signs, 2 signs, professionally printed, saying feminists say no to genocide. And then we printed more that said Gaza genocide, because a woman went past us and said, well, what genocide? What are you talking about? Like, most people aren't paying attention. They got a lot to worry about. And I think those are the people who will confuse and do confuse Jews and Israel. And we've all gone to a lot of effort to make the distinction that you're making. And I think you're quite right that the universities protesting now, no, that's not anti-Semitism.
And what I saw in the universities, I didn't see anti-Semitism either, but I sure did see a resistance to Israeli politics.
Yeah.
And I shared them. And I think probably, university professors shouldn't go around talking about things like that to promote their own views. And maybe I didn't, but I imagine a lot of people knew damn well what I thought about that, which I was critical of Israel's policies long ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you didn't have skin in the game, so you were able to see it more clearly, maybe, than a lot of people. And it's far more conflicting for those of us in the community.
Yeah, okay.
It's very conflicting because you're giving up old loyalties. I'm telling you that the time I was living in New York for 4 years, and as I joined this group of friends, which was almost immediately, they welcomed me in, feminist, wonderful women, Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, I mean, wonderful, wonderful people. Mm-hmm. And my dear friend Esther Broner, the novelist, and they were protesting. And so I began to read. And I'm telling you that the time I spent studying what Israel's past really was and what the new historians were showing us, I often compare it to peeling off a layer of skin. It was so painful and so difficult to let go of those old ideals, and to admit that I'd been lied to substantially, and I'm sure every country teaches lies to their children. Look at America. But yeah, I'd been lied to about the origins of the state, what was done in the name of rescuing Jews. It was a terrible awakening. It was very, very difficult for me, very painful. And I'm a very stubbornly loyal person. That's one of my flaws. I've been loyal to some people far too long. But in this case, I was a slow learner. I really was.
Tell me about
how are you relating to some of your people in the Jewish community that have not sort of gone through this eureka moment that you have? How do you talk to them, or do you just say we'll accept each other's differences?
I would love it if it were that way. At the very beginning, within a week after October 7th, there were crazed rumors flying around. And it reminded me of stories I had read about the First World War, where insane rumors, somehow I associate it with Belgium, where they were talking about babies being impaled and beheaded and so on, which wasn't true. And when the first thing that came out was babies being beheaded, and that was from the ultra Orthodox. I wouldn't believe a word they say. Those people are nuts, in my opinion. And they invented this calumny. Of course, what Hamas did was horrific, horrific, horrific in any terms. You didn't have to invent horrors. They did horrors. But I put out on Facebook just this. I said, please don't circulate things that could be just rumors, because rumors in wartime can cause a lot of harm. So check your facts. As a journalist, that's what I wanted people to do. There were friends who denounced me. Said, you're pro-rape. What are you, pro-murder? You're pro-Hamas. And how did they get that from this cautious little expression? And these were dear people I love, that I've known for a long time. I would never have dreamed that this could happen, that they wanted to vilify me and dump me as a friend. I thought about it a lot. I was kind of horrified. I thought, do I want to lose friends just to express myself on Facebook? And I made a decision that I would not discuss it on Facebook. It was too open to misinterpretation and calumny, and I just didn't want to deal with that amount of hatred in my life. However, as the year and then 2 years went on, I was totally in agony about what Israel was doing. I was in complete agony to see children being slaughtered, schools, libraries, hospitals, everything that a culture created. To see it, Israel had always boasted, remember how it could target anyone. They could target 3 generals meeting in Baghdad and kill them so neatly. But in Palestine, no, they had to bomb everyone. It was unspeakable. Unspeakable. And then the starvation. At that point, nobody spoke up for us during World War II. Nobody. There was a guy that actually escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto and got to England because he thought, if I can only tell Churchill, if I can only let him know what's happening in Auschwitz. But no one would listen to him. Absolutely no one. And he killed himself. And this was the story. Nobody cared. I couldn't bear that we had become the people who didn't care, who wouldn't look, who would inflict such horrific suffering unto generations. You think any of those children who survive are going to have what we call a normal life with that amount of trauma in their background? The losses, I couldn't bear it. I had to do something, and I didn't know what to do. I'm 86, and I'm not in the paper anymore. So I just impulsively decided. I remembered standing with the women in black in 1988 in Jerusalem. I was at a conference there. The Israeli women had invented this form of protest.
Yes.
Protest the occupation. Silent, all in black for mourning, and holding a sign for 2 hours. Elena and I don't think Bella made it to that, but my daughter and Esther Broner, we went to that demo and stood with the women in black, and I was so moved by the power of it, the silent vigil. And I decided, okay, we'll do women in black. That movement sprang around the world. Women in Bosnia picked it up. It was something women could do with dignity but force. You weren't interrupting people, confronting people, screaming slogans. It wasn't that kind of aggressive rebellion, because most women are afraid to do that, really, I would think. I certainly didn't want to go to any very vociferous demonstrations. So I decided to do women in black impulsively. Within a week, I got signs printed professionally. Cost quite a bit. So I only made 50. And I thought, well, so I'll have 50, I'll have 25 left over. I didn't expect more than 20 people to come to that first vigil. And I just put it on Facebook. Sisters, there's a genocide. We have to protest. We have to come stand with me if you want to. Young and Bloor, 3 o'clock on Friday. Wear all black. So I went to that corner with my signs. And I didn't know who would show up, and 300 women came pouring onto the street. 300. I couldn't believe it. There was this pent up, stifled feeling of people. We have to protest. A lot of them afraid to be called anti-Semitic because, as you said, Meta, that's been weaponized. Any criticism of the genocide and you're called an anti-Semite, very effective at silencing people. But here was a protest they could take part in. And we strung out all along Bloor Street for a long, long line, Jill. And a cop came over to me just as it began. They had bicycle cops on every corner because there was another pro-Palestinian protest on the north corner. So they were there anyway, the cops. They came over to me, this cop, and he said, "Are you the leader of this gang?" I love that. Gang, yes. I said, yeah, I guess so. And he said, "Well, what are you planning? Are you disrupting traffic?" "No, sir. We're standing at the curb in silence." "So no shouting?" "No shouting, silence." "What about pedestrians? Are you interfering with the pedestrians?" "No, we have no intention of doing that. We're standing along the curb. It's a nice wide sidewalk." "Okay," he said, "go ahead." And at the end of the protest, he came over and he said, "You have no idea how powerful you looked." All of us strung out in this long line. And it's true. There's power in that kind of protest because we were all wearing the same thing. So it's very distinctive. It's not a mixed up, everybody in different colors and holding illegible homemade signs. It was far more effective. So our fourth vigil is tomorrow.
Yep. I'll be there. Yep.
Wonderful. We aim to keep on doing it. Might be raining, but we will bring umbrellas.
What days, and advertise it right now, what days do you meet? And
well, normally we were meeting Fridays. That was just arbitrary on my part. But we were clashing with the other pro-Palestinian demonstrators who tried to sort of blend in with us. It wasn't working. They had a drum that banged very loudly, and somehow we were getting tangled up with signs they were carrying that had hate messages. I didn't want to be associated with that. I thought, fair enough. I tried speaking to them very nicely. "Brothers," I said, "we're all on the same side. Can you stick to your corner? We'll stick to this corner." But they couldn't seem to do it. They kept drifting back. They had signs that I didn't like saying the whole world hates Israel. That's not the point of our protest. It's not about hating Israel. It's about stopping the genocide and the slaughter and the starvation. So I decided, okay, I conferred with some of the others, participants in the vigil, and we agreed we'll do it Thursdays instead. Why not? So from now on, Thursdays, every second Thursday, 3 to 5 at the southeast corner of Yonge and Bloor.
So presumably women who agree with you on your basic,
yes,
what your points are, your specific points, but presumably if I felt like it, I'm not too mobile anymore, but I could go with black and join you, right?
Any woman who agrees with us, and I would say only about maybe a third of them are Jewish or fewer, but it's people of conscience and women who want to protest this slaughter.
And what do the placards say?
There are two of them. One says, "Feminists say no to Gaza genocide," and the other one say, "Women in Black say starvation is a war crime." And it is. It's a war crime. And those are the two signs, and those are the two big points.
And at what hour? From when to when?
3 p.m. to 5 p.m. some people can't stay for that long. A lot of people bring their walkers or a camp stool. I mean, it's sort of a second wave feminism reunion in a way. Most
What
of
about
us
the
have been here.
age? What range of age or what median age would you find there?
I would say I would guess a lot of people are in their 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
And, but there are younger people too, more and more. So I'm very pleased about that. And Palestinians,
Mhm.
few Palestinian women. And there was a
Yeah,
woman
is there
walking.
anything for men in black? Anything equivalent that you would recommend for guys who want to do the same kind of thing?
Yeah, there were demonstrations all over town now. It seems every day there's another grandmother's gasp, the grandmothers, I forget what that stands for. There are several different grandmother groups that protest. There's Charlie Angus's resistance group that protests. Lots of them. No men need to be left out. But ours is a feminist protest and it's all women. And I like that. I'm proud of that. I wanted my older daughter does a lot of international work still. She was the co-founder and leader of the Stephen Lewis Foundation for 15 years. And then she decided to move on and do other things. So she's assisting a number of international feminist groups. And she said the young Palestinian women are enraged and heartbroken that Jewish feminists, Western feminists, aren't standing up and protesting. And I said, but surely we are. This was before I started the vigil, but not as feminists. So it's not visible. We're just women in the crowd. That's why I thought of Women in Black. Our placards say feminist, because I want the Palestinian women to know, if they ever learn of it, yes, the feminists stood up for you. You can't be a feminist and let a whole people be slaughtered. You're not entitled to the proud name of feminist if you can stand for genocide. So,
Well, tell me about the potential political impact on say, Canada's policies. There, I assume that the question is about that the main point would have to do with the sale or the donation or the provision of weaponry to.
yes.
What?
And I'm thinking that all these demonstrations, the government must know. They've got ears on the ground. They know that there's widespread horror that Canada's complicit in this genocide. They know that. And the more there are protests, I mean, our little protest is one thing, but there are lots of them. And I'm sure the government's hearing from people, and MPs are hearing from their constituents. Stop selling, we're not selling weapons. Yes, you're selling bullets, hundreds of thousands of bullets. And those bullets, we know where they end up. Journalists, children. Yeah.
Tell us about the changing polls, because I think the question is Canada mostly goes along with whatever the U.S. does, and the U.S. Canada has its own historical, bad logic, but certainly the Trump administration is really hostile to anybody who supports the Gazans, and he seems to allow Netanyahu to do anything he pleases, or in fact, he eggs him on with creating things like a Riviera on.
Yeah.
Because beautiful spas on the Riviera where people can spend money and live high on the hog, and all the Gazans get deported, and so on. And now I assume that at the moment he's still got enough support in public opinion polls in the U.S. to get away with it. And I haven't read any polls. Presumably something is changing as a result of your actions and others. Can you brief me on what is going on in terms of changing public opinion and how and just where it stands at the moment, both in the U.S. Well, of course, U.S. is almost alone in its extreme defense of Israel in every United Nations vote and so on.
That's the politicians, though. The public and the public in Canada. I've seen polls, and I'm very bad at numbers, so I'm not going to repeat any numbers. I'll get them wrong. But the polls are quite definitive that the majority of people in the US and in Canada oppose this genocide and oppose Netanyahu's regime. The politicians are a different story. They have to get the message from below, from their constituents, before they'll change their mind. Of course, Trump has no mind, so there's nothing to change. He's just a bundle of infantile impulses. So I don't think that can change. And their support for the war is massive, not like ours. Ours is much more limited. But still, any participation, I think, is terrible.
And you don't expect really to reverse their policies.
Not the Americans, but I sure expect Carney to step up and do better. Well, his policies so far, I called him Poiliev in a bespoke suit. Look at 5% to defense. Is he nuts? Taking away money from the CBC when he said beforehand that he would give $150 million to. I was so ecstatic that the CBC was going to be safe, but no, he's just like every conservative. It's like Stephen Harper, heartless cutbacks and money going to pipelines. The world is burning, and he's going to build pipelines. Surely it's a clinical example of insanity to be building pipelines when the world's in flames. Anyhow, I hope Carney listens in this one. He won't listen about the pipelines, that's for sure, but maybe he'll listen about the support for Israel, because it's not popular. And in Israel itself, they hate Netanyahu. He's making war endlessly because otherwise he'll be thrown out. He knows it.
I think we've gone over our time, but I don't want to end this because you're so wonderful. I guess I want to end it by saying I hope lots and lots of people, women, will wear black and go on Thursdays at 3:00 to Bloor and Yonge Street in Toronto.
And I know they will, Meta, and this will help also. And Women in Black are protesting in Vancouver, in all sorts of little towns. There are groups of Women in Black now.
Wonderful to talk to you. God bless you. I mean, I'm not sufficiently atheist to avoid an expression.
Maybe I shouldn't tell people I'm atheist. It startles them still, but
right. I have room in my heart for atheists. And certainly
it's so good to speak with both of you. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Yeah.